Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastyachade Shatarne Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchakalptarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya evacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Yes, devotees. So here we go. Deeper into the ocean of Bhagavad Gita. And it's an interesting chapter, a very interesting chapter, the three modes of material nature. It's a sort of, easier, would you say, but more approachable type of chapter. Yeah. It's not so, like subtle, perhaps you might say. It's very straightforward generally, yes, and less complicated than the 13th chapter. Okay, so here we have a little introduction. Let's see, what shall we say? So, okay, yeah. In the previous chapter, we heard about the Kshetragya and the Kshetra, particularly in this context now, the soul, the Kshetragya, the knower of the field, the soul, and the super soul. But here, of course, we're focusing on the soul. We've got to get ourselves out of the entanglement in material life. So we heard about the interactions between the Kshetragya and the Kshetra, or the soul and Prakriti, or us and our material bodies. So Lord Krishna here and there was in a number of places, like, I don't know, I should have counted actually 4, 5, 6 verses at least. Lord Krishna made mention of the modes of material nature and how we're caught up in the modes. In a few places in the previous chapter, he mentioned that, but the Lord did not give any information about how the modes are working and how we're entangled in detail, the particular, you could say, characteristics and features of our entanglement. In chapter 13, it was just general, that there's us and the body, or us and Prakriti. Towards the end of the 13th chapter, us and Prakriti, the material nature. Yes, so in this chapter 14, the Lord will explain quite elaborately actually, about the nature of our entanglement. Because what is our entanglement in terms of the connection with Prakriti? Our entanglement is with the modes. That's how it's working, particularly. Right. So what we have here then, it's a description of the field and its interactions and Prakriti and the Purushas. These different, at least some of these different things that we've encountered in chapter 13, and how they're related, but in more detail. Yeah. So you could say that in many ways, and maybe just completely, it's the same subject matter as chapter 13, but from a different perspective, in more detail, like that. And at the end of the last chapter 13, Lord Krishna talked about a process of jnana, detachment. You remember that vision of how we're separate from the body, we're not the body, and he said, if you can get that, then you will achieve liberation. So, or at least it'll help for liberation. So those verses were talking specifically, that last section of the 13th chapter, in terms of Prakriti and Purusha. Yes, Prakriti and Purusha. So this now, what we're going to be studying for the next few days, you could say it's a more detailed description of Prakriti and Purusha. At least Purusha in the sense of the soul, us. Yeah. So in the purport of the first verse, Srila Prabhupada says, just listen to this. If one understands this chapter through the process of philosophical speculation, that's interesting, he will come to an understanding of devotional service. In the 13th chapter, it was clearly explained that by humbly developing knowledge, one may possibly be freed from material entanglement. It has also been explained that it is due to association with the modes of nature that the living entity is entangled in this material world. We just mentioned that. Now, in this chapter, the Supreme Personality of Godhead explains what those modes of nature are, how they act, how they bind, and how they give liberation. That's interesting, isn't it? Anyway, stay tuned. Yes, because that is how it is put sometimes. How they give liberation, the modes. And they do, they help, they participate in the process. So Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur makes a comment. In the 14th chapter, the bondage caused by the gunas and the symptoms are described. The many symptoms of the disappearance of the gunas and the cause of their disappearance, bhakti, are also described. That's nice. Srila Baladev Vijayabhushan says, the 14th chapter explains that the gunas are a cause of bondage, that they give 3 results, and that they are destroyed by devotion to me, means to Krishna. He's speaking as Krishna, Baladev Vijayabhushan. So the 3 results, there are 3 modes, goodness, passion, ignorance. So there are 3 types of entanglements. I mean, there are many combinations also, but in sort of relatively simple terms, there are 3 modes, and there are 3 types of entanglement. Entanglement in goodness, entanglement in passion, entanglement in ignorance. But these types of entanglements, the results of contact with the modes, or becoming controlled by the modes, those results are destroyed by devotion to the Lord. So this is all going to be discussed. Okay, so here we go. So we have here, in this chapter, we have 3 sections. It's not a long chapter. I mean, there are shorter. It's 27 verses. We're already encountered, was it 2 chapters, I think, which had only 20 verses. At least one. Anyway, this has 27. So it's relatively on the shorter side. So there are 3 sections. First section is from verse 1 to verse 5. And we call that the liberation and conditioning of the living entity. The liberation and conditioning of the living entity. Then the second section is from verse 6 to verse 18. Verse 6 to verse 18, and this we call the description of the 3 modes and the results of their association. Yes. By sadhu sangha, you become liberated, you go back to Krishna. Sadhu sangha, sarva shastre koi. Lava matra sadhu sangha, sarva siddhi hoy. This is Lord Chaitanya speaking, and he says 3 times that by the association of devotees, all the scriptures say that by the association of the devotees, one achieves all perfection. But by the association of the modes of material nature, a different result comes, and it is not good. Right, okay, and then the third section, from verse 19 to verse 27, is called Transcending the Modes. Transcending the Modes. And it's an interesting section. It's an interesting section. All right, so first of all then, let us go into the first section, verses 1 to 5. The liberation and conditioning of the living entity. And this, devotees, we have divided up a little bit here. We have divided into 2 subsections. First subsection is verses 1 and 2. And there the idea is that by becoming fixed in the knowledge which is just now coming, one attains perfection and is liberated. In this knowledge which we're going to be getting about the modes of material nature. Yes, because that's the following knowledge. The knowledge is an analysis of the modes and how they operate in regard to different aspects of our being. You could put it that way. Yeah, so we call this, by becoming fixed in the following knowledge, one attains perfection and is liberated. Verses 1 and 2. All right, so let us read verses 1 and 2, just the verses, and then we'll come back and examine the purports a bit. Verse 1. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "Again I shall declare to you this supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge, knowing which all the sages have attained the supreme perfection. All right? The supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge. He's talking about knowledge, about the three modes, and how to get out of them, of course. And verse 2, by becoming fixed in this knowledge, one can attain to the transcendental nature like my own. Thus established, one is not born at the time of creation or disturbed at the time of dissolution. Okay, that's good. That's very good. So back to verse 1. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, again I shall declare to you this supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge, knowing which all the sages have attained the supreme perfection. Yeah. So, in anticipation of certain questions, the Lord is promising to speak about certain topics while praising them. Like what topics? So, for example, what types of results come from contact with the gunas, the modes? Krishna is anticipating such a question. Yeah. And the idea is that before, rather than waiting to be questioned like that, in anticipation, he's answering those questions. Yeah. He's explaining those things before even the questions come. What types of results come from contact with the gunas, the modes? What are the symptoms of people who are associated with the modes? How can someone become liberated from the modes? So Krishna, in anticipation of exactly these questions, they're kind of, you could say, the obvious questions. So Krishna is, you could say, preempting the questions. Yeah. Yeah. Rather than wait for them. And now let's have a look in the purport. Srila Prabhupada Srila Prabhupada makes a really interesting statement. It's really quite a special statement. Krishna says, this is now, where are we? Well, it's the third sentence in the purport. If one understands this chapter through the process of philosophical speculation, he will come to an understanding of devotional service. What do you think of that? Isn't that normally that we hear how we should not speculate? I think we've all heard that many times. Yeah. I remember when I was a new devotee, we would have discussions, and sometimes we'd go off on a bit of a tangent, and the leader of our group, he would tell us quite strongly, stop speculating. Stop speculating. But now here Prabhupada is saying that if you understand this chapter through the process of philosophical speculation, you'll come to an understanding of devotional service. Wow, Hari Bol. So here I have from elsewhere. In fact, I didn't even note from where exactly, but this is now, I'm going to read to you something from Prabhupada, which addresses this question. Because here Prabhupada uses the term philosophical speculation. Generally we hear about what? Mental speculation. Prabhupada, we'll read now, Prabhupada's going to explain there's a difference, a big and important difference. So listen to this. This is Prabhupada. As for the difference between mental speculation and philosophical speculation, we take it that everything is known by the psychological action of the mind, so that philosophical speculation is the same as mental speculation if it is merely the random or haphazard activity of the brain to understand everything and making theories, ifs and maybes. But if philosophical speculation is directed by Shastra and Guru, and if the goal of such philosophical attempts is to achieve Vishnu, then that philosophical speculation is not mental speculation. It is just like this. So now Prabhupada's going to explain give us a practical example. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita that I am the taste of water. Philosophical speculation in the accepted sense then means to try to understand, under the direction of Shastra and Guru, just how Krishna is the taste of water. You get the idea? And just, seeing we're talking about the taste of water, if you don't mind. Oh, Krishna, Krishna. All right, so that was Srila Prabhupada, helping us to distinguish between philosophical speculation and just mental speculation. Mental speculation is just the mind, whatever our sort of, fertile brains can come up with. Philosophical speculation means examining Krishna conscious statements from the perspectives of what is stated in Shastra, what is stated by the spiritual master, by Prabhupada, the acharyas, like this. Okay. So therefore, we should understand, we note that Krishna has said that he's going to declare again the supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge, the best of all knowledge, the best of all knowledge. And through this knowledge, all the sages have attained the supreme perfection. So we should understand that the superiority of the knowledge in this chapter is not just in the sense of it being about the modes of material nature, but it's particularly about how we can transcend them through the process of devotional service. That is the process by which we can transcend them, as we'll see in due course. In other words, in principle, and not simply in principle, but even, in terms of real substance, it's exactly the same idea or ideas which we received before, like in chapter 9, chapter 10, those most deeply focused parts of Bhagavad Gita, practically focused on devotional service. Yes, but with the details of the material nature, which we do need to understand, and understand how to transcend in the context of devotional service. Right. You know, having said that, it is possible that a person, whoever, not a devotee, shall we say, can study the subject matter of this chapter about the modes. And they do. You know, many people in India particularly, many people study Bhagavad Gita. So many. And many of those many people are not devotees. And many of them study from the point of view of personal improvement, self-improvement. So there are certain parts of Bhagavad Gita which are addressing in more sort of easily understandable terms for your ordinary person how you can improve yourself. And this part here about the modes and how they affect you and, you know, what's wrong, this is something that such people can relate to very easily in terms of figuring out what is my position in the modes and then how to improve myself. Just like previously we just read, if you remember, it was chapter 13, wasn't it? It was chapter 13 where Krishna was explaining from 8 to 12, from verse 8 to 12, Krishna was explaining about many different types of qualities. Who remembers what was the first of those qualities in chapter 13, previous chapter, verse 8 through 12? Can you remember? Amanitvam. Yes, okay, Maharaj knows. Humility. Humility was the first. Right, so people, ordinary people can relate to this. But if such people approach this chapter, or those, you know, that whole list there, from 8 to 12 in chapter 13, if they approach these instructions of Krishna about the modes and those things from the material perspective, just, you know, how I can become a better materialistic type of person, and not like a devotee, how I can become a devotee, then they'll come to the mode of goodness. And they won't go any further than that. Maybe they'll become liberated in an impersonal sense, but not more than that. And generally speaking, they won't even become liberated, more just mode of goodness. Right, so let's see. Here's a little comment from Srila Baladev Vijayabhushan. He says that this knowledge is the best because, quote, it is the best among all topics of knowledge concerning the jiva and prakriti. It is similar to fresh butter extracted from yogurt. That's suitable for the month of Damodar, isn't it? Mother Yashoda was extracting the butter from yogurt. Incidentally, that Damodar pastime, I've given a couple of classes about this pastime, just, yesterday, the day before. I forgot to mention the actual day of the Damodar Leela, the day that the pastime occurred, is the Diwali day. That's the day that Mother Yashoda tied up Krishna, and therefore he became Damodar, he who was tied around the waist with ropes. So, in other words, we could say it is a more detailed explanation of the entanglement of the soul, which has already been described in chapter 13, a more detailed description of that. All right, so on to verse 2. By becoming fixed in this knowledge, one can attain to the transcendental nature like my own. Thus established, one is not born at the time of creation or disturbed at the time of dissolution. Yeah, so again, the point is transcending. That's the point, not just becoming a better person, less passionate, less ignorant, more pleasant, more peaceful, like that, more tolerant. Not just that, but the point is to transcend. And to transcend through devotional service. And therefore, here's an interesting little side point. Therefore, Srila Prabhupada preached so much about how we're not these bodies. So much about how we're not these bodies. Because if you perform devotional service thinking that you are your body, then you won't be able to advance. Like the Prakrita Sahajiyas, they're one group, they're one of the upper sampradayas. They have the idea that love means just in the form of physical relationship, sexual relationship with the opposite sex. I will be Krishna, you will be Radha, and we will come together like that sexually, and in this way we'll develop love, which is love for Krishna. That's because they can't understand. We are not these bodies. I am not a man, you are not a woman. We're not these things. These identities are irrelevant. And not just irrelevant, but they're a major, major distraction from the reality. And so like this, you won't be able to advance. That Krishna's mercy, what if Krishna's merciful, what will he give me? Something material, some money, some good health, something like that. But Prabhupada commented strongly that there's a verse by Krishna in the 10th canto in which Krishna says, if I really like someone, I take everything away from them. Oh, Krishna. And therefore some people think, Krishna, don't like me too much. I'm not so nice. You shouldn't bother liking me. All right. Yeah, so it's very personal. Prabhupada mentions in the first paragraph, it's personal knowledge. It's not impersonal knowledge. Yeah. So in the second paragraph, Prabhupada explains that when you're situated in transcendental knowledge, then you're on the same platform as the Lord. Basically means you're on the transcendental platform. Krishna is Satchitananda Vigraha, from Lord Brahma, Brahma Samhita. And we're also Satchitananda Vigraha, eternal, full of knowledge, full of bliss. Of course, his Satchitananda body is bigger than ours, but qualitatively the same. So like this, as you come into transcendental knowledge of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Prabhupada points out here in the second paragraph, then you come into knowledge of the spiritual sky and spiritual relationships. One gets a spiritual form, spiritual activities in a personal relationship with Krishna, and goes back to Godhead. So Prabhupada concludes the purport: to obtain such knowledge, one must develop all the spiritual qualities. One who thus develops the spiritual qualities is not affected either by the creation or by the destruction of the material world. Those are Srila Prabhupada's concluding words in the purport. Baladev Vijayabhushan makes an interesting little comment. Listen to this one. He says that the Lord and the devotees have 8 qualities: absence of sin, absence of death, absence of old age, absence of hunger, thirst, and lamentation. So absence of those 6 things, and on top of that, all desires are fulfilled and truth is fully manifest. These are 8 qualities of the devotees. So now we go into the second subsection. It's from verse 3 to verse 5. And so Krishna now begins his description of Prakriti, or the Kshetra, the body, in terms of the modes. So first of all, what he's going to do right now, he's going to explain that he is the father of all living entities. As the father, he impregnates them into the material energy, which is referred to as Brahman here. The term Brahman is used to describe different things actually, but sometimes it is used to describe the material nature. So he impregnates them into the material energy. Brahman, the Mahatattva, the 24 elements, however you want to look at the material energy. Then the living entities become conditioned by that material energy in terms of its 3 modes. They become differently conditioned. So let us read verses 3 to 5. The total material substance called Brahman is the source of birth, and it is that Brahman that I impregnate, making possible the births of all living beings, O son of Bharata. Verse 4. It should be understood that all species of life, O son of Kunti, are made possible by birth in this material nature, and that I am the seed-giving Father. Verse 5. Material nature consists of 3 modes: goodness, passion, and ignorance. When the eternal living entity comes in contact with nature, O mighty-armed Arjuna, he becomes conditioned by these modes. Conditioned. Conditioned, you can say. One way of understanding this term, conditioned. We are conditioned souls. one way of understanding it is that it can be taken to mean we have accepted the conditions of material life as our living conditions. We've accepted. What is life? You have a material body. That's one of the conditions of life in the material world. If you're in the material world as a materialistic person, then you have accepted that condition. Every conditioned soul has a material body. That's one of the conditions of material life. Yeah, so you can say that's what it means to be conditioned, that we have accepted the conditions, and now we are governed by those conditions. Okay, so now back to verse 3. The total material substance called Brahman is the source of birth, and it is that Brahman that I impregnate, making possible the births of all living beings, O son of Bharata. So here Krishna is explaining how the contact of the jiva with the gunas, with the modes of nature, through beginningless ignorance, creates bondage. So he's explaining it through speaking about the method of appearance of the field and the knower of the field. So in this verse 3, in the Sanskrit, Krishna is referred to the material nature as Mahad Brahma. Basically means the great Brahman. And this is because it extends through all places, all times, continuously in the material sphere. Yeah. It extends, the material nature, Mahad Brahma, it extends through all places and times continuously. Right, yes, so here we are, Kshetragya, body, soul. So Prabhupada says, the Mahatattva is the total cause of the total cosmic manifestation, and that total substance of the material cause, in which there are three modes of nature, is sometimes called Brahman. Sometimes. Not always, but definitely sometimes. That was sort of the beginning, in the beginning part of the purport. And then Prabhupada also says, let's see, where is this? The Supreme, yeah, okay. It's in the first paragraph. We're just going to read a couple of sentences. I'd say about 3 or 4 sentences from the top of the paragraph. The Supreme Person impregnates that Brahman with the seeds of the living entities. The 24 elements beginning from earth, water, fire, and air are all material energy, and they constitute what is called Mahad Brahma, or the great Brahman, the material nature. So to elaborate on it further, in the second paragraph, Srila Prabhupada gives the example of a scorpion laying eggs. So the scorpion lays the eggs in piles of rice or wherever, and then goes away. And later on, the eggs, the scorpion doesn't come back like birds. They sit on their eggs until the chicks, the babies come. The scorpion doesn't do that. The scorpion lays the eggs and goes, and that's it. And then the eggs hatch within, Prabhupada's saying, giving the example of rice. And so some people think that scorpions come from rice. But they don't. They don't. Scorpions come from scorpions. They come from mother scorpions, from the eggs that have come from the mother scorpion. So similarly, in terms of the creation, the seeds for all living entities are given by the Supreme Lord. Lord Mahavishnu glances over the material nature, and the living entities are injected through the glance into the womb of Mother Nature. But in terms of this example of the scorpion, the idea there would be that the people think that that life just comes from matter. Yeah, we have just come from the material bodies of our mothers. And there's no cause beyond our parents. But there is a cause. That's the Supreme Lord, who in the beginning injected us into the material world. If he hadn't done that, we wouldn't be in the material world. So it's not just the fault of our parents. Right, so, and on to verse 4. It should be understood that all species of life, O son of Kunti, are made possible by birth in this material nature, and that I am the seed-giving Father. Okay. Well, he's just restating what he said in verse 3, but, perhaps a little, anyway, slightly different words. So you could say Krishna is just making the point that he is the Father, very clear. So in this context, how the subject is being discussed, the point is that, Prabhupada says, in this verse it's clearly explained that the Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna is the original Father of all living entities. Then about the living entities, as they are manifest in material life, in the material world, the living entities are combinations of the material nature and the spiritual nature. And Prabhupada goes on to explain that these living entities, they're not only here, they're on all planets, including Brahmaloka, higher, lower, in all species. They're in water, Prabhupada says, they're in fire. I remember I read in Back to Godhead many years ago, maybe in Prabhupada's time, but it was around that time, how some scientists were doing research about an underwater volcano somewhere in, I think, the Pacific Ocean. A volcano had erupted way down, long, many thousands of feet down. And the superheated water was coming up. So, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. And then it just turns into steam and it evaporates. But now this water, because of the pressure of the other water, this water was not turning to steam. It was coming up to the surface as superheated water, like some hundreds of degrees, but it was water still, liquid. So somehow they gathered some of that water. And you know what they found? Back to Godhead told us. They found there were living entities in that water. Yeah. So, somehow they took the water and put it in containers so it didn't just evaporate on the spot. So now they've got the superheated water with the little creatures. But you know what they found? Back to Godhead said, first of all, the temperature was, I forget, but at least 400, 500 degrees. It was really hot by water standards. And the little living entities were there. They found out as the temperature came down 300 degrees, some of the creatures started dying. 200. By the time it got beneath 200, like approaching the regular boiling point, they're all dead because it was too cold. It was too cold for them. So they're living entities in fire on the sun planet. We understand the living entities have bodies of fire. Haribol. Our bodies are 70, 75% or whatever water. So, yeah, we're basically water living beings in that sense. And so it's all coming from Krishna. All these many species. So directly or indirectly, Krishna is always the ultimate father, and material nature is always the mother. So Prabhupada says the purport is that the material world is impregnated with living entities who come out in various forms at the time of creation according to their past deeds. Which brings us to verse 5, the last verse we're going to look at, just very short purport. Material nature consists of three modes, goodness, passion, and ignorance. When the eternal living entity comes in contact with nature, O mighty-armed Arjuna, he becomes conditioned by these modes. Yes. So now the appearance of the living entities under the modes, this is going to be described. So how there's going to be description of what are the modes, what types of bondage arise for the jiva from association with these different modes. Yeah. And this verse is giving just the basic sort of introduction, the basic idea. Yeah. And here we see, at least in the Sanskrit, and of course in the translation, the specific modes are mentioned. In chapter 13, the modes were mentioned, but just as a group, not individually. Here now they're mentioned. Yeah, and like we said, to be conditioned means accepting those conditions, goodness, passion or ignorance, and then acting and living and your whole existence revolving around and being understandable and expressible in terms of the modes, except of course for the fact that we're eternal conscious living beings. So Baladev Vijabhushan says they bind the modes with their quality of illusory happiness and distress, which are accepted by the jiva without understanding their true nature. People, life is going on under goodness for someone. For someone else, life is going on under passion, and they're very active and doing this and deciding that and all these things. And in other cases, life is going on under tamagun. They're very dull, and they've got no vitality and vigor. They'd rather sleep. For them, in many cases, the perfection of life, the best thing in my life is when I go to sleep. That's it. That's the best part of my life. This is fact. And Krishna's going to explain in exactly these terms. So that will go on into tomorrow evening. Starting from verse 6, we said verse 6 to verse 18, description of the three modes and the results of their association. And interesting little point, in the course of discussing these verses, we will also refer to the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, the teachings of Lord Kapila, where Lord Kapila talks about devotees who are practicing devotional service under the different modes. A devotee in goodness, a devotee in passion, a devotee in ignorance. It's very interesting. So that's part of what we'll discuss tomorrow night. So we'll see you all tomorrow night. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.